When the warning first echoed across the world, it did not begin with fear. It began with a confession from a man who had spent his life surrounded by privilege, influence, and the kind of power that quietly shapes nations without ever appearing in front of a camera. He stood on a stage with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths pressing against his voice, and for the first time in his carefully engineered existence, he did not speak like a billionaire, he spoke like a human being finally admitting that the world he helped build was trembling beneath its own foundations. He said he had witnessed something that changed him, something no amount of wealth could protect him from. Something that made him question every belief he ever held about success, progress, and destiny. People expected him to talk about markets, investments, technologies, or global risks. Instead, he spoke about a different kind of economy, the one that trades in human potential, hope, and the quiet fire that lives under every person's ribs, waiting for a moment to rise. The room fell silent because everyone could sense it. This wasn't another dramatic prediction crafted for attention. This was a plea. A wake-up call. A truth so simple and so raw that it bypassed logic and struck straight into the place where courage either grows or dies. He said the real danger the world faced wasn't collapse, war, inflation, or even the unknown technologies racing ahead of ethics. The danger was spiritual exhaustion. The silent epidemic of people waking up every morning feeling like they were built for more but chained to a version of life that numbed them. He said he had traveled the world, met kings and presidents, walked through the highest boardrooms and the poorest villages, and everywhere he went he saw the same expression in people's eyes, the expression of someone who had forgotten their own power. He said the world didn't need another billionaire. It needed awakened individuals, people who remember they are not spectators in life but creators, people who realize that the same fire that makes stars burn also lives inside human ambition, people who understand that history doesn't change because the wealthy decide it will. History changes because ordinary people refuse to remain ordinary. As he spoke, something strange happened. The audience, made up of skeptics, analysts, journalists, and leaders, began leaning forward, not because of the man, but because they could feel a piece of themselves rising to the surface. His warning wasn't about doom. It was about responsibility. It was about the invisible turning point humanity had reached, where the next chapter would not be written by governments or corporations, but by individuals who finally realized how much their choices mattered. He said humanity was standing at a crossroads where the old world was dissolving faster than anyone expected. Work, identity, meaning, relationships, dreams, everything was being rewritten. People were waiting for clarity, waiting for solutions, waiting for direction. But the truth he had discovered was that waiting was the most dangerous thing of all. Waiting was how civilizations crumbled. Waiting was how people surrendered their destinies without even realizing it. He said the moment he understood this, everything inside him shifted. He realized he had underestimated the power of a single person's decision. He realized the world didn't break because of one catastrophic event, it broke because millions forgot that they were capable of greatness. And he realized that the world could be rebuilt in the exact same way, through millions remembering. He urged people to stop looking at themselves through the lens of limitations that others had handed them. He urged them to stop accepting the idea that their dreams were unrealistic, when the entire world was built by people who refused to accept that very idea. He reminded them of every forgotten truth they used to believe when they were younger, the truth that they were born to rise, born to explore, born to build, born to transform. He said the next era of humanity would be shaped not by wealth but by awakening. He said the individuals who understood this, truly understood it, would become unstoppable forces. They would rewrite their lives. They would rebuild their communities. They would rise from circumstances that had once seemed impossible to break. And when enough people awakened, the world would shift so dramatically that future generations would look back and wonder how anyone ever doubted their own power. He confessed that for years he had believed that money was the most powerful tool in the world. But during the darkest moment of his life, when every achievement felt hollow and every success tasted like ash, he discovered a truth far more potent. The most powerful force on earth is a human being who refuses to give up on their purpose. He said humanity had reached a moment where every individual choice was magnified, where every decision to rise, to grow, to try again, to break a cycle, to heal, to start something new, had the potential to trigger ripple effects that would shape the century. He told the crowd that the world did not need them to be perfect. It needed them to be awake, fully alive, willing to step into the unexplored territory of their own potential. He spoke about the storms he saw coming, not external storms, but internal ones. The storm of doubt people fight quietly. The storm of insecurity. The storm of fear that whispers, "You can't change your life." He said these storms were more dangerous than any global conflict because they destroyed people before the world ever had the chance to see what they were capable of. And then he said something that pierced the air like a blade: the world is not ending. The world is waiting. Waiting for people to rise, waiting for people to rediscover discipline, not as punishment but as power, waiting for people to stop numbing themselves with distractions and start building the futures they once dreamed about, waiting for people to stop surviving and start living. He said the moment a person decides to take full ownership of their life, a shift happens in the universe around them. Mountains that once seemed immovable begin to crack. Opportunities that once seemed distant begin to appear. People who once underestimated them begin to watch in disbelief as they grow into someone they never thought possible. And he insisted this wasn't philosophy or poetry. It was the fundamental law of progress. The world bends for those who refuse to break. He warned that the real threat was not the uncertainty of the future but the shrinking of human spirit. He said the greatest tragedy of the modern world wasn't poverty or conflict but the silent acceptance of a life far smaller than what people were capable of living. He had learned that a life without fire is a life half-lived. A life without purpose is a life spent sleepwalking. A life without courage is a life never truly touched by destiny. And then, With a voice that trembled not from fear but from conviction, he said, "You were born for more than you are settling for." When his words settled into the minds of those listening, something subtle began to shift in the room. People who had entered with crossed arms now felt their hands relax. People who had come expecting another predictable speech found themselves fighting an unexpected tightness in their chests. It wasn't because of the billionaire standing in front of them, it was because his message forced everyone to confront something within themselves. Something they had ignored for years. Something they had buried. He spoke about the greatest illusion society had ever created, the belief that only a few people were meant to rise while everyone else watched from the sidelines. He said that was the lie that weakened civilizations. The lie that allowed people to shrink into the background of their own stories. The lie that convinced millions to forget that they, too, carried the seeds of greatness. He said every human being feels a calling at some point in their life, a whisper that suggests they are capable of something extraordinary. And almost every person in the world silences that whisper because they have been conditioned to believe that extraordinary is for someone else. Someone richer. Someone smarter. Someone luckier, but he had spent decades among the wealthy, the powerful, the genius-level thinkers, and he revealed a truth almost no one expected: these people were not extraordinary because they were destined. They were extraordinary because they were obsessed with ignoring the limits others tried to place on them. They treated every obstacle as a signal to grow stronger. They responded to fear not by retreating, but by taking another step forward. They acted with a faith in themselves that most people only reserve for their heroes. He said the world had misinterpreted greatness. Greatness wasn't a reward for the privileged, it was a responsibility for the courageous. It belonged not to those who had everything handed to them, but to those willing to become more than they once were. To those who refused to settle for a life they didn't feel proud of. To those who kept going even when every voice, including their own, told them to stop. He said that somewhere right now, a person living in a small room with nothing but a dream might be more powerful than a billionaire sitting in a glass tower, because the one who still believes in possibilities always has more potential than the one who thinks he has arrived. Growth belongs to the hungry. Transformation belongs to the brave. The future belongs to the awakened. He spoke about the moment everything changed for him, not the moment he made his first billion, not the moment he acquired his first company, not the moment the world started calling him a visionary. It happened on a night when he sat alone in a hotel room, surrounded by luxury but consumed by emptiness. He had spent years chasing external success only to discover that internal silence was louder than any applause he had ever received. In that silence, he realized he had built a life that impressed the world but did not fulfill his soul. That night, he stared at his reflection in a window overlooking a glittering city and felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child: honesty. The honesty to admit that he had everything except meaning. That he was surrounded by people but had lost himself. That he had run faster and faster without realizing he was running in the wrong direction. He said that the greatest crisis in the world wasn't financial or political, it was the crisis of direction. People were moving, but they didn't know where. They were working, but not for something that made them feel alive. They were dreaming, but only in the few quiet seconds before sleep, never in the daylight where actions were required. He said he finally understood that night that purpose wasn't something a person found, it was something a person created. Brick by brick. Choice by choice. Step by step. He learned that the world becomes clearer when a person stops asking, "What will happen to me?" and starts asking, "Who do I want to become?" He didn't change everything in a day. But he made one decision. And that single decision became the spark that awakened him. He decided that his life would no longer be a performance for the world but a gift to the world. He decided that his success would no longer be measured by numbers but by the number of lives he helped empower. He decided that every fear he once avoided would become a challenge he would master. He warned the audience that most people never experience this shift deep inside themselves because they fear letting go of the familiar. They cling to comfort as if comfort has ever been the birthplace of transformation. But he said comfort is the silent cage of potential. It's the invisible prison where dreams go to suffocate. And every person must eventually decide whether they want a life that feels safe or a life that feels meaningful. He said he had met thousands of people who were waiting for the right moment to change their lives. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for motivation. Waiting for signs. But waiting had stolen more dreams than failure ever had. Waiting had convinced people that opportunity was something that arrived, when in truth, opportunity was something that had to be created. He said that the people who transform their lives do one simple thing differently. They begin before they feel ready. They take the first step when their hands still shake. They speak their dreams out loud even when their voice trembles. They show up for themselves even on days when they feel lost, tired, or unworthy. And that simple act of showing up becomes the silent engine of their evolution. He told the crowd that the world needed fewer spectators and more creators. Fewer critics and more builders. Fewer people saying someday and more people saying today. Because every person who decides to rise gives permission to others to rise as well. He said his greatest fear wasn't losing his wealth, it was losing the version of himself that dared to grow. And his greatest realization was that the world changes every time a single person decides they are finished living small. He looked at the audience with a conviction that made the air heavy and said, "You don't need to be wealthy to change the world. You need to be awake. You need to be willing. You need to be relentless." Here is the final part, flowing, motivational, inspirational, no headings, completing the long narrative. He paused as if allowing the weight of his words to sink into each person's memory, and then he continued with a calmness that felt like truth finally being spoken after decades of silence. He said that the greatest turning point in any person's life is the moment they stop negotiating with their limitations. The moment they stop asking for permission to believe in themselves. the moment they stop shrinking so others feel comfortable. He said the world had been asleep for too long because people had forgotten that destiny is not a reward, it is a decision. He shared how he began meeting people not to evaluate their skills or measure their success, but to study the spark in their eyes. He said he discovered that the most powerful humans were not the ones who had perfect plans, but the ones who carried imperfect courage. They stumbled, they failed, they doubted themselves, but they kept moving. They kept stretching their minds to imagine better days even when reality felt heavy. They kept building a future that didn't exist yet because somewhere deep inside they believed it could. He said those were the people who would lead the next era. Not the loud ones. Not the famous ones. The awakened ones. The ones who decided that their past would not dictate their future. The ones who refused to let circumstances define them. The ones who understood that a single act of courage can redirect an entire life, and that an entire life, once transformed, can influence generations. He said the world often misunderstands awakening. People think it's a dramatic revelation, a moment of lightning that strikes out of nowhere. But awakening, he explained, is usually quiet. It happens at 3 a.m. when a person realizes they're tired of pretending to be someone they're not. It happens in traffic when someone whispers to themselves that they deserve more. It happens the moment a person breaks a promise they've been making to their fears and makes a new one to their future. He said if people truly understood how powerful they were, they would never again settle for a life that didn't feel aligned with their soul. They would stop giving energy to things that drain them. They would stop living as though their dreams were negotiable. They would stop surrendering to doubt as if doubt were a law instead of an illusion. He said the world changes when people understand that their life is not a rehearsal, it is the only performance they will ever give. He urged everyone listening to stop waiting for the perfect moment to begin. The perfect moment, he said, is a myth created by fear to delay transformation. The moment someone decides to rise, that is the perfect moment. The moment someone decides they are worthy, that is the perfect moment. The moment someone decides that their past cannot hold them hostage anymore, that is the perfect moment. He said one of the greatest tragedies is how many people spend their entire lives trying to avoid failure, not realizing that failure is the sculptor of strength. Failure teaches resilience, shapes discipline, builds confidence, and exposes the parts of a person that were meant to grow. He said the people society calls successful were simply the ones who kept failing forward. They learned to walk through the storms instead of waiting for the weather to clear. They learned to run through fear instead of bargaining with it. They learned to transform pain into purpose. He looked at the audience with a softness that came only from experience and said that the world would continue to shake, evolve, collapse, rebuild, and rise again. But the individuals who decide to awaken will never be powerless, no matter what era they live in. They will never be lost, because direction comes from within. And they will never be defeated, because defeat only exists when a person stops trying. He said he had discovered a truth so simple it sounded unbelievable: everything a person wants begins with the story they tell themselves. If someone wakes up and tells themselves they are limited, they will be. If they tell themselves they are capable, they will rise. If they tell themselves they are unworthy, life will reflect that belief. But if they tell themselves they are built for greatness, life will rearrange itself to prove them right. He said the future does not belong to the strongest or the smartest, it belongs to the most committed. The ones who decide to build even when no one is watching. The ones who believe in possibilities even when surrounded by doubt. The ones who continue even after they fall. The ones who rise so many times that giving up no longer feels like an option. He said the world was changing faster than anyone expected, but that was not something to fear. It was something to embrace. It was an invitation for reinvention. An invitation for courage. An invitation for people to step into the roles they were always meant to play. He said humanity was entering a chapter where authenticity would matter more than appearance, where purpose would matter more than profit, where character would matter more than reputation. He said every person alive had a choice, to be shaped by the times or to shape the times. To be controlled by circumstances or to rise above them. To be another whisper in the crowd or to become a voice that inspires others. He said the world needed people willing to choose the latter. As he reached the final lines of his warning, his voice shifted, not louder, but deeper, grounded, unshakable. He said that people often wonder when their life will finally change, as if transformation were an event waiting on a timer. But life doesn't change when time passes. Life changes when the person living it decides it must. When they say enough to the habits that weaken them. When they say yes to the dreams that frighten them. When they say now instead of someday. He said that humanity had reached a moment where every individual awakening mattered. That no one was too small to create impact. That no one was too broken to rebuild. That no one was too late to rise. He promised that the day a person believes in themselves fully, the world around them begins to rearrange itself in ways that almost seem miraculous. And then he delivered the final line of his warning, the line that people would remember long after the speech ended. Long after the cameras stopped recording, long after the world returned to its noise, the world is waiting for you to wake up. When you do, everything changes. He stepped back from the podium, not as a billionaire, not as a leader, not as a legend, but as a man who understood that the greatest power on earth is the moment a human being decides to become who they were always meant to be. And in that room, and in the hearts of the millions who later heard his words, something quietly ignited, the kind of spark that has rewritten history again and again, a spark that reminded people they were stronger than their fears, bigger than their past, brighter than their doubts, and destined for more than the life they had settled for. A spark that whispered to each listener, in their own voice, "Rise."